in Iran. So what are your thoughts overall, and what do you think about the recent nuclear talks between Iran and the Security Council? And what do you think the effects will be based on the current sanctions that are pre-existing, which has frozen up to $100 billion in capital the world over with Iran?
Well, Peter, I think one of the things that I think is most interesting about Iran is that pretty much the only thing you ever hear about it is about its nuclear ambitions, and about what a terrible place it is, and what an awful country it is. But what you don't really get a sense of is that it is, I think, potentially an enormously exciting story. It's a country with 77 million people. It has the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves, second largest proven gas reserves. Demographically, it's in a sweet spot. It is a country where I went there in February, and the only things you can buy from the West that pretty much the rest of the world can buy, all the toys, what you can buy in Iran, you can buy Coca-Cola and you can buy electronics. But all the other stuff that people buy in the rest of the world, you can't buy in Iran because of sanctions. So there are, I think, a few different dimensions of what one day will happen in Iran. There's going to be, for starters, there's going to be an absolutely enormous consumer boom one day when people in Iran are able to buy cars, they're able to buy iPhones legally, they're able to just buy all this stuff that the rest of the world can buy. There's been massive underinvestment in infrastructure, in the energy infrastructure, and just in walking down the streets of Tehran, of other cities. The state of the roads, the state of buildings, there is virtually zero Class A office space in the entire country. There are no hotels up to international standards. There's not a single international chain that operates in Iran because of sanctions. So I think those are just a few of the dimensions that one day will open up. Now, to get back to your question, I think the key issue is when will sanctions be lifted, and when will this sort of dream become a reality? It's been about 35 years that Iran has been under sanctions of one sort of another, whether it's by the U.S. and the European Union and or the United Nations. It is largely a political question. I think that at some point it will become an economic question, and I think that as the price of oil remains weak, it will become an increasingly pressing economic issue in Iran, because the Iranian people are sick and tired of not being able to travel, not being able to send money anywhere, not being able to buy stuff, not being able to be educated elsewhere. So there's a lot of internal push there, and I can't really get into the internal politics of the supreme leader, of the president, and everything else, but it's a very complicated bundle of issues there. I think what's more a little bit easier to understand is the Western and international interest in investing in Iran. When I was there, I was visiting Tehran and Isfahan, a city a few hundred miles away. Within a few weeks of when I was there were major trade delegations from France and from Germany, and these were CEOs of global multinationals based in France, based in Germany, who were visiting, trying to lay the groundwork to meet the key decision makers in Iran and to lay the groundwork for potential investment in the future.
Right.
At some point, that will be, I think, an important driver. You might have some of these countries that will say, look, if you politicians don't figure this out, we are going to do everything we can to push you to figure this out. And in the meantime, China and Russia are significant investors in Iran, and they'll continue to push as well.
So when you look at a perfect example of this, and it's been frustrating in terms of bilateral trade, is the trade between India and Iran, in which Iran's able to export some of their crude oil over to India, but the capital is held in the Indian currency. And what is being exchanged is actually soft commodities like rice in exchange for the crude oil, which is still relatively frustrating for the Iranians in terms of their economy. I think that in terms of these sanctions, like you're indicating to me that you're noticing some interest from these countries to figure out any way or any means possible to continue to trade with Iran. And I get a sense that Iran's very much open to trading with many countries, especially Asia.
Yeah, very much so. I think Iran would, well, the language of money is international, and Iranians certainly would love to trade anything with anybody anyway. But for Western businesses, that is a legal issue because they're when sanctions were eased somewhat, there are a number of exceptions, but it's still difficult. And it's most difficult because Iran is not part of the Iranian banks. The Iranian financial system is not part of the SWIFT system. So it's just physically impossible to transfer money into the country or transfer money out of the country.
Right.
And that's a serious logistical challenge, as you can imagine.
One of the interesting stories I've heard, actually, is that if one wanted to buy various petroleum products, and if you were actually somehow got the visa to enter into Vietnam, you'd have to somehow carry some of the physical cash with you in order to purchase some of these commodities, which is, theoretically impossible to achieve. But that is one of the requirements or ways in which they could actually accept purchases from private buyers, actually.
Interesting. Something else that they do, it's in essence a cash swap. So there are all sorts of entities that are actually set up and recognized by the Iranian central bank that operate in other countries. They're called exchange bureaus. So if I'm in Iran and I want to give cash to somebody in, let's say, India, as you said, and this is an entity that exists purely to, if you think of an oil swap, it's a cash swap. So no money is actually exchanged. It doesn't go through any sort of wire. But there's somebody in India who wants currency from Iran and someone in Iran who wants currency from India. So they, through this kind of cash broker, come to an arrangement.
Right.
To exchange money without exchanging anything. Nothing physically moves, and that's how all these transactions are done.
Very similar to China, I've also noticed is that countries that experienced a lot of sanctions will try to find all these alternative routes to be able to invest or to trade with various different countries. So, for example, the Chinese will build up special purpose vehicles within countries like Singapore in order to trade without the various restrictions that the Chinese might have with other countries. And I've heard and seen anecdotal evidence that Iran also does that as well, which is not surprising, but definitely worth noting. So, Kim, what do you think are ways in which investors can get some exposure into these markets? Because the reality is they're doing quite well in terms of the equity markets. The TSE has been performing, I believe, up quite a bit so far this year even.
The Tehran Stock Exchange, it's actually one of the cheapest equity